Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am Stephen Evans, Executive Director of FotoFest, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our series of creative conversations where we gather artists and other creative thinkers to discuss the issues in their work and the issues around their work and issues in society today. And we're really excited today to have artist Krista Svalbonas and jack of many trades and expert curator and organizer Peggy Sue Amison here today to discuss Krista's work. This program is part of the series, the exhibition series that FotoFest has been doing, a year-long series called Public Life that was organized in response to the pandemic and FotoFest wanting to be able to present work to the public in a safe way that many people could see. And it's made up of 3 distinct exhibitions that are at 4 sites within the neighborhood in which FotoFest is based in Houston, called Arts District Houston. And each of the exhibitions features 4 artists, so it's 12 artists over the course of a year. And Krista's work is featured in the 2nd iteration, which is called Public Life, Home and the People Who Live There. Major funding for Public Life and its programs is provided by the Texas Commission on the Arts. And additional program support is provided by the Brown Foundation Incorporated, the Houston Endowment, the National Endowment for the Arts, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Wortham Foundation, Silver Street Studios, Sawyer Yards, Papa's Restaurants, Lovett Commercial, and generous donors to the FotoFest Annual Fund. And you can find a full list of our major supporters at the end of this program and on the FotoFest website, which is www.fotofest.org. Public Life and its programs are curated by FotoFest Associate Curator Max Fields, who's also joining us today. And I thank Max and our FotoFest Communications Manager, Brandon Taw Harris, for their organization and support of the talk today. Now about our speakers. Krista Svalbonas holds a BFA in photography from Syracuse University and an MFA in interdisciplinary studies from SUNY New Paltz. Her work has been exhibited in a number of exhibitions, including at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, Howard Yuzurski Gallery in Boston, Klompching Gallery, and ISE Cultural Foundation in New York City. Her work has been collected in a number of private collections, as well as at the Cesis Art Museum in Latvia. Recent awards include the Rhonda Wilson Award in 2017, the Puffin Foundation Grant in 2016, and a Bemis Fellowship in 2015, among others. And in 2015, also, Svalbonas exhibited a solo installation at the Spartanburg Art Museum in South Carolina. She is an assistant professor of photography at St. Joseph's University and lives and works in Philadelphia. And she has exhibited with FotoFest twice in the past 2 years, so I'm happy to say. Peggy Sue Amison is the artistic director of East Wing in Doha, Qatar. And Amison has a long history of collaborating with numerous emerging and established international photographers, publications, festivals, and biennials. As the artistic director of East Wing, the platform for international photography, she supports the development of new and innovative photographic work. And she has curated exhibitions in cities across Europe, the United States, and China, and has written for photographic publications and multiple artist catalogs. Amison is a founding board member for the Belfast Photo Festival in Northern Ireland and is the former artistic director of Sirius Arts Centre in Cork, Ireland. Originally from the United States, Amison currently lives and works in Berlin, Germany, and she has frequently collaborated with FotoFest at our meeting place portfolio review for artists and as a lecturer, curator, and panelist for many FotoFest programs. So I welcome you both, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say to each other. So please.
Thank you, Stephen. Because Krista's practice is so diverse, we wanted her to give a short presentation about her full practice before we go into our discussion. So Krista, do you want to start that? And I want to thank everyone for being here on a Saturday afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. So thank you for your attendance. So Krista, if you want to start, that would be great.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate my thanks to FotoFest for asking me to be part of this Creative Conversations, and also to Peggy for joining me in this conversation, and for all of you to come on a Saturday afternoon and spend some time with us. So I've organized this talk, as Peggy mentioned, to focus on my interdisciplinary activity as an artist, but then also to talk about how photography has always had a relationship to that practice, visible or not so visible, which you'll see in a moment. As Stephen mentioned, I'm formally trained as a photographer, both in my undergrad and grad, and my practice has taken a form of interdisciplinary in a variety of media. But photography has always played an integral role in that practice. And for a long time now, my work has focused on ideas of home, displacement, migration, and a sense of place. And because of that interest, I have been photographing my environment and my surroundings ever since I picked up a camera in high school, really. I've been photographing my surroundings for a long time now. And when I started painting, those photographs really became the source material for my paintings. So this series is called Penumbra. I was living in Jersey City, right outside of New York at the time of producing this series, and really photographing the concrete jungle at that time. So doors and windows and overlapping building spaces and the architecture that was really enveloping me in that environment, and using those photographs as direct source material for the painting. So kind of taking that imagery, simplifying it into its basic geometric forms, and producing these paintings. At some point in time, I realized that since these paintings were so much about architecture, that it seemed natural to really incorporate the exhibition space within that conversation, to have a conversation about inside-outside space. And so I started producing these wall drawings that extended beyond the canvas and incorporated the architecture of the exhibition space where these were being shown. And that changed. They were very site responsive, depending on where I was exhibiting. Those wall drawings, morphed and changed and developed with each new exhibition. I had a residency at Cooper Union, and there was an exhibition at the end of that residency, and this is an image from that. And the next series I produced, Transparency, which you're seeing on the wall there with white-ish panels. Those were also referencing the city landscape, again, continuing that sort of wall drawing aspect onto the exhibition space. But with this particular exhibition, I thought it was really important to incorporate my source imagery. And so that's what you're seeing on the adjacent wall. There are small images of my source material that was used to produce these paintings, so the audience could really understand the relationship of photography and painting through this exhibition. In Jersey City, I was living across from a low-income housing complex for a number of years. And public housing has always been of interest for me in the United States. I started researching it quite in depth when I produced this series, which is called Project 8. And I was interested in its origins, really with the New Deal and FDR, and how the origins of public housing had a link to European modernist architecture and also to Soviet architecture. So being of Baltic origins, that connection was of particular interest to me. So I started producing this work again, photographing those buildings extensively, taking those photographs and painting, in this case, on industrial felt. And so I started painting oil on industrial felt and carving into the paintings to more mirror the architecture that I was referencing within the work. A move to Pennsylvania prompted this series, which is In the Presence of Memory. So I grew up in PA, in rural Pennsylvania, and so I moved there for a couple years, and this series emerged out of that. I'd always been interested in agriculture and farming and barns and the sort of the architecture that surrounds that, and its decay throughout Pennsylvania. So these sort of dilapidated, sort of forgotten vestiges of that agriculture. And that's where this series was born. I started photographing the barns in their landscape as larger landscape images, and then coming in close and really focusing on the texture and details of these structures. And so those details became silk screens, and then I would silk screen on the painting first, and then paint on top of that, referencing again those more distant images that I was taking. And so this was a transition for me where my photographic imagery started, appearing in the painted surface and started appearing as part of the paintings. A move to Chicago started this series. So I accepted a job teaching at Columbia College in Chicago, and it was a huge move for me. I've been a Northeasterner of PA and of the United States for quite some time. So that move the landscape was really different. It was a really different space for me to occupy. And I had a hard time figuring out how to move forward with my work. And I was talking with a friend of mine, a very close friend who's a painter. And she smartly said, you've been, you have this archive of all this imagery, and you've been photographing your surroundings forever. Why don't you take a look at that imagery and see if it speaks to you, and see if something comes from that. And that is exactly what I did. So I started printing out these photographs from this massive archive I had of New York, rural Pennsylvania, and then building up of Chicago. And that's where the series Migrants was born. I started taking those photographs, cutting them apart, reassembling them, really thinking about my own personal migration throughout the United States, thinking about how ungrounded I felt at that time period. So these structures were very much sort of floating in space, no up or down or right or left. They almost feel like they're swirling objects. And I was definitely playing with perspective, both 2D and 3D in a flat plane, thinking about how I was shifting that on a two-dimensional surface. So it seemed natural for me, since I was already doing that two-dimensionally, to really build them out into three-dimensional forms and really push that perspective in a three-dimensional space. And so Migrator was a series that came after that, and these are again referencing, they are images from my collection of New York, Chicago, and Pennsylvania. They are printed on aluminum, CNC routed, and then custom wooden bases are built for them at different protruding angles that come out into space. So they are wall-mounted sculptures, and depending on how you move around them, they have a life of their own. They shift and change, and aspects of the photograph come out towards you or recede away from you. And there's a very intentional kind of distortion that I was playing with this work. So I had a moment where I, for a couple of years, I had been thinking about, my own migration and delving into that and moving around the United States. And I kept coming up to the question of why, why am I talking about this? Why am I thinking about this? Why is that always coming up for me? And inevitably that led to me thinking about my family's history as a daughter of refugees who ended up in the United States shortly after World War II. And so Displacement, this series, really stemmed out of that investigation into my own personal family history. But inevitably, as many investigations do, it led to be something that's much, much larger and much more vast than that. So I started by discovering where my parents were held as children, as refugees in Germany. And then that turned into documenting about 50 displaced person camps in Germany that existed right after World War II. And to just give a little bit of a historical context to this work. So in 1941, under Soviet occupation, Stalin gave the order for the Baltic citizens educated and upper class to be deported to Siberia. Once they were in Siberia, they were placed in forced labor camps that had very extreme conditions that essentially led to death. And so when the Germans came in, they essentially halted this larger deportation plan that was arranged by Stalin. And the paperwork for this deportation plan became accessible. And families could find, or they did find, their names on these lists to be the next to be deported. So as the Soviet army came in and started pushing the German army out of the Baltic states, those individuals knew that they could not stay. They had to leave. And they ended up fleeing to Germany, ended up in these displaced person camps for a number of years before they could emigrate onwards. And so both my parents were held in these camps, and in the process of discovering where these camps were located, I came across a fair number of plea letters that the refugees were sending to the governments of the United States, UK, and Canada, all asking for asylum. They were basically explaining that they could not be repatriated, they could not go back home, they were going to be seen as enemies of state. So I am taking the text from these letters and laser cutting them into my images of the displaced person camps. And the pieces for this series, they're very sculptural. They have a definite presence and three-dimensionality to them. So this piece is a two-layer piece. The top layer is entirely cut with text from the letters, and the bottom layer is partially cut. And that is how you're getting that kind of three-dimensional look to this piece. Some of the other series, other works in this series, are partially cut with text. So it looks like the building is disappearing or falling away. And that very much harkens to the fact that this history is actively disappearing. We are losing firsthand individuals who have experienced this history. And this is a close-up, so you can see a little bit about of the text within that image. And then that leads me to this series that is part of Public Life in FotoFest. This is my latest series. It's in progress. And these are images that I have taken primarily in Lithuania of Soviet structures that were built during Soviet occupation. And through a process of laser cutting, I am combining traditional Baltic textiles with these images. And the reason being is there was a very concerted effort at that time to have this homogeneous Soviet culture, really, or Soviet Union, and really to eradicate any kind of individuality of the cultures of the countries that the Soviet Union had usurped. And so this series really brings that juxtaposition and that tangibility to its forefront. The textiles and keeping this heritage alive was very much seen as an act of political resistance at the time. And that concludes my slideshow for the piece. I'm going to stop share, and here we go.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I thought it was just really important for people to get a better idea of how you are as an artist. And my first question is, did you always want to be an artist? You have such a strong interest in architecture. Was there a point where you were thinking about wanting to be an architect?
Not really, no. And people do often ask that when they see my work, because it is very architecturally based. But no, I've always wanted to be an artist ever since I was a little girl. And that didn't always mean photographically, but it meant that I was constantly trying my hand at a variety of media. You know, I was always doing something artistic. So yeah, that was part of my nature as a child.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I can really relate to that. That was my upbringing too. There's so many layers in your work, and there's so much about memory in your work. I'm just wondering, when you started to bring all that together, when did you start to really understand that your practice was about this layering process, whether it's painting and silkscreen or felt and using certain materials, or this, and I mean the whole idea of laser cutting the actual voices of people into work. When did that all really start to solidify for you?
I don't know if it's totally solidified just yet. I think I'm still in the process, which is what I love about being an artist, right? Like every new series leads me to a new discovery about myself and a new question about who I am, my identity, my ethnic heritage, my family. So I think I'm still processing that. And every series, it's not that I think about how layered it is. It just arises in how I approach the subject matter and how I start producing the work. In the text-based work for Displacement, that took a lot of time just trying to figure out how to work with a laser cutter in that kind of fashion, and to cut text and have an image hold up and not fall to pieces. And so that was a whole experiment in and of itself. And as a fluke, I mean, a lot of people ask me, how did you start using a laser cutter in that fashion, and what made you think about that? I was just being trained on using a laser cutter at that time period. I like I mentioned, I'm interdisciplinary, so any skills that I can kind of accrue are of interest to me. And so learning that, there was like a little moment of clicking. I was reading through these letters and thinking, how precarious their lives were, and reading about these pleas to really try to find a new home. And something made me feel like I need to combine these words with my images, and I need to do it in a way where they are part of the image, that they are part of that woven fabric of history in that.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times with artists that use photography, there's always this tiny disconnect between, there's the lens and the paper, or the lens and the object, or the enlarger lens and the space, or the computer and the image. And for me, as when I was an artist, that was always a big struggle for me. I always wanted to get my hands into something. So that's one of the other reasons why I really wanted you to talk about your multidisciplinary practice, because I think that's kind of a draw for a lot of artists. They want that physicality. And I think we see that in photography, especially in the 21st century, where again, there's this big return to materialism, the material of the photograph. If you're looking at different works that are coming out now, where people are ripping and tearing and forming and using things like textiles to print on to make a three-dimensional shape out of a two-dimensional object, which was originally a three-dimensional object. So I think, when I saw how you were incorporating the actual voices, I started to think about, and I mentioned this to you before, about epigenetics, this idea that we inherit our family's DNA, and there is a theory that we inherit their trauma or just their experiences. And I know for me, there have been places in my life where I've been, where I feel like I've been there before. And then I find out later that there's some family connection. And I'm wondering, I know you heard the stories growing up and you saw the photographs, because you say that your family actually, when they left, that was one of the few things they could bring with them. So you saw photographs, but for you to actually approach those buildings after, I would imagine, many hours, you went to 50 buildings, did you say? 50 camps. After all that research, to finally walk up to something, what was that experience like for you?
It was amazing. It was history literally, and this might sound, a bit cheesy to say, but history literally came to life. It really did, all these stories that I had grown up with. And then also this sort of lack of understanding what it meant for my family to be refugees or displaced people. I knew what that meant, and I knew that they were in these camps, but I didn't know what these camps were. Essentially, I didn't know, what the landscape of these camps were, and being able to like kind of set foot in the same place that my parents were as kids. It was emotional. It was completely emotional. Tear jerking. I'm a little tear jerking right now thinking about it, but yeah, it was incredible. It was really an incredible experience. And it brought all of those stories and all of that identity kind of rushing forward when I was standing in the same place.
Yeah, and I love the fact that, in the work that's presently up in Houston, that you also bring in these textile patterns, because for me, pattern is memory as well. I mean, we think our memory works in sort of patterned ways, and we hold our history in patterned ways. I mean, if you look at someone like Sanford Biggers, who uses like quilts in his work, and he uses quilts that were used on the Underground Railroad to direct people, but then he makes them into something else through feeling. And so it was just so enthralling for me to see you do that again, to bring in this sense of culture, because I think the pandemic has really shown us how important and valuable culture is to us. Normally on a day-to-day basis, I think it ends up falling, as we say in Ireland, on the long finger, where it's something that, oh yeah, there's that. But the minute there's a catastrophe, it's the first thing we rush to. And also during the Second World War, it was when it ended, that was one of the first things people wanted. So they were having operas in, bombed out buildings, because they needed that culture. And I really feel we're going to see a huge rush to museums, but also there's this desire to reconnect with stories. And I love how you bring that together. I wonder how your family reacts to your work.
They're really proud of me. They're really, it is not a very well-known history. I keep coming across that, both in the US and actually in Germany as well. So it's not very much publicized, this sort of history of Soviet deportations and why these Baltic citizens had fled. And so keeping that history alive has made individuals in the US, extremely glad that I'm doing that, especially since my parents' generation, they're the last generation left that has experienced this history. And when they go, that's gone. And that's mind-boggling to me, and so I really want to through this work really preserve that history and that legacy and have us remember our past.
What's been an inspiration to you? I mean, is there an artist who's inspired you? Is there readings that have inspired you? Where do you draw your inspiration from?
So there are a number of artists that have inspired me. Ai Weiwei is definitely an inspiration. Doha with his architectural kind of cloth pieces is amazing. Anne Hamilton, those are all installation based individuals. Yeah, I've always been inspired by, interestingly enough, I mean, there are some photographic inspirations as well, but I tend to kind of look at other media quite a bit, and at media that's immersive and three-dimensional as far as inspirations go.
Mm-hmm. The patterns that are in the work that's presently up in Houston, are there stories behind those textiles? Is there something a little bit deeper where we have the voices in the earlier work? Is there a voice that resonates through the type of patterns that are in the work that's presently up in Houston?
They're not as much in the case, but it's a collective heritage, it's a collective voice. And so these are textile patterns that I grew up with, many of them in Latvian, which is very similar in Lithuanian and Estonian. The patterns are very similar to one another, but they are on everything that is kind of woven. So on like mittens that I got, or scarves, or tablecloths. I've family tablecloths that have these patterns on them, curtains that have them. So they've constantly kind of permeated my life as a child growing up, and not really realizing them. But, in this series, going in and investigating, I have some books that show you how to like sew these patterns. And that's what I was using to produce the larger pattern scales on the photographs there. And so it was kind of like going back into my childhood, looking at these patterns. And what was really interesting in the fact of kind of connecting displacement in that series, which it's a phenomenal thing actually for these refugees who were really, really resilient at the time. They continued all of this pattern work and weaving and sewing in the displaced person camps. Mm-hmm. So that was something that they, kept continuing and continued on, and they'd have these basically like folk exhibitions where they would invite the public in to the camp to kind of view the folk weavings, and then like wood carvings, and sort of all of these things that were of Baltic heritage. They would invite people in to kind of take a look at what this history, what this culture is that they have, which I'm always like amazed at, that they they hit the ground running after World War II, like creating small organizations, creating schools, producing this kind of work. They, as you mentioned, in times of trauma, we go back to this cultural heritage. They started theater groups. They, put on theater productions. They had musical groups. They had choirs. I mean, it's incredible the amount that they achieved during this time span of, being refugees in this place where they had no idea where they were going to go. They had no idea what the future held.
And again, you were saying that there was that some of these traditions were sort of outlawed at the time. So how did they get around that? Do you know? I mean, because you say they actually invited people in to look at it, but then there's also this aspect of it being sort of against the policies of the country they were living in for them to do that.
Yeah. So in the case of that example, I mean, they were in Germany in these DP camps, creating these installations and inviting the public to kind of come in. So at that point, they're in either the US zone or the UK zone that was run of Germany. And so that same kind of aspect didn't really play a part in that camp and in the history of the camps there. But as far as keeping that up within the Baltic states under Soviet occupation, I'm not exactly sure of the particular sort of history of that all, but from what I understand is, that was something that was clandestinely like continued in the house, and continued as part of a private life that was kind of held up and continued in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, everything that you've talked about here just really shows the power of community and the power of holding your culture, and how your culture can give so much solace to you. But I am curious, when your parents moved to the US, did they continue to speak their native language, or did they teach you, or did they stop speaking?
Yeah, so there were two schools of thought for the refugees that were coming over. There were those that avidly really wanted to continue the traditions on and pass the language, pass folk dancing, pass the weavings and all of that cultural heritage on to the future generations. And there were others that decided that they had migrated to a new country, and then that they were going to be citizens of that country. And so my family background, my parents continue those traditions. It was the first language I spoke. Actually, English was a second language. So I learned Latvian first. And I went to Latvian camp as a kid. So there were these pockets of camps that kind of continued the whole cultural heritage. So at the camp, I learned how to do Latvian folk dancing. I learned those weaving traditions and jewelry traditions, actually. the history, everything that was kind of all ingrained and continued. And I think that experience as a child definitely helped me create the work that I'm creating, because I really have always felt of two worlds. I felt that I am, in the US, but very much a part of this history that my family lost, and very much connected to that. And that's created this like strange fissure in how I kind of occupy where I am in my space, where I feel connected to a place that, I've been to, but my family lost, and then also living in this sort of melting pot of the United States, but not quite feeling, not having the same sort of backgrounds as everyone else, right? Because I grew up very much invested in that cultural heritage.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing I see in your work that I can also really resonates with me is in the Migrants and Migrator series, this idea of bringing all these different places you've been together as sort of a question about home, but also in the New Deal, how your earliest work, how you very much discuss the politics of architecture and the politics of public space. And as the series is called Public Life, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the New Deal, but also I just wanted to say I really resonate with this idea of not really knowing where home is, and seeing that construction that you made of these three different places really spoke to me, because I mean, I'm from the US, but I lived in Ireland for 15 years, and then I was in Dubai, and now I'm in Berlin, and it's like, I'm not really sure where home is anymore. It's kind of where your people are. But can you talk a little bit about the politics of architecture? I know we're coming up on time and we're going to open the floor to the public shortly, but I just wanted to kind of get you to talk about that a little bit and how it plays in your work.
Yeah, I mean, there's hints of that too in Project 8, where I was really investigating public architecture in the United States and that connection to these sort of European ideals of this like worker housing and creating this sort of architecture that was meant for all, for everyone, kind of this utopian sense of architecture, and how that was negatively kind of interpreted in the United States, but also in the Soviet Union too. I mean, in the architecture that's part of what remains, which I'm photographing, I mean, those buildings were extremely poorly built. I mean, they were quickly built. They were made out of form concrete. The plumbing in some of them are just non-existent. And there are, I mean, there's also stories of Soviet architecture where, the elevators don't quite work in all the buildings, and they skip floors, and sort of this kind of idea of creating this utopian architecture, but then the output of it is very much less than utopian. And in the Baltics, there's a very complicated kind of relationship to those buildings, because they can't be torn down. There isn't enough resources for the individuals living in them to kind of rebuild their life and be torn down. But they are very much a constant reminder of occupation. And so there is this tenuous kind of relationship to those buildings. And the individuals who lived through Soviet occupation, understand that very tangibly. But I have some relatives who are much younger than me, who have not lived through Soviet occupation, and they have a completely different feeling about these buildings. There's a amphitheater that was built during Soviet occupation in right outside the city of Vilnius, and there have been a lot of petitions of either preserving it or tearing it down. And depending on which side of history you are on that, there is a very, strong feeling of one way or the other. And the younger generation, is in the mind of preserving it. And then, this older generation is in the mind of tearing it down. So that was very, evident to me, kind of being in Lithuania, talking to individuals and photographing these buildings, how kind of the political history of plays into the architecture.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and when you talk about architecture in the New Deal, about how where in in Lithuania, a lot of those places are still standing. In the US, we kind of got rid of them because they went from being this idea of a social inclusion housing to being dangerous. And they ended up tearing them down. So again, it's this idea of, and which you talk about quite a lot when you write about your work, this idea of politics and its connection to the spaces that we live in and how the spaces really affect us emotionally. It's a place that we keep our memories. I mean, we all have pictures in our head of the places we grew up or the places we moved to, and how that connects to who we are, both culturally and just our own specific individual identity. And so it's always it's interesting to see how you handle that. There's just two really short questions. One is, how do you source your materials? Because it feels really tactile. So I'm curious how you choose your materials. Do you work with somebody or do you just go in and explore and experiment?
It depends on, it depends on the series and it depends on what I'm working with. And how did I get into industrial felt? I definitely work with a manufacturer for that, actually.
Well, it was from Pittsburgh, right?
They actually are like in Allentown, kind of, on the more closer to the to New York City. And so what was interesting about them is people don't typically paint on industrial felt. And so I was coming across a lot of problems in doing so. And working with them, they brainstormed these complications with me and thought, if we shear the felt in a certain way, and then now you'll be able to paint on it better. Even though that it's like not at all used for artists, this industrial felt's used for industrial applications and gears and things like that and machinery. But they're very, very much willing to work with me with that. And the same part happened with a laser cutter. So the files that I create are extremely intricate. They're like very dense and very intricate. And through a series of speaking to a lot of manufacturers, there's only 2 types of lasers that can handle the type of file that I make. And so one of the companies actually is referring to my files as a benchmark for creating better lasers moving forward, and better mechanics moving forward. So it depends on what I'm working on, but I do come up with problems, which then lead me to contacting, someone, a manufacturer and someone larger.
That's the real beauty of working with artisans, because they have as much passion for the material they work with as you do for your work. My last question before we open it up to the audience is, what's something that you don't think people know about your work that you think they should know?
That's a hard question, Peggy. We save that one for last. Let me think. I guess the main thing, which is why you prompted me in kind of creating that slideshow, is that a lot of individuals don't, that they'll either see my work and relate it photographically, or if they knew me prior, they'll see my work and relate it to painting and installation, but they don't necessarily see the two worlds colliding. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't know about my practice and how it's grown over the years, and it's constantly included photography, whether it's visible or not, and kind of how it's progressed over the years through a variety of media. So I think that's the one thing that eludes people at times.
And is there anything coming up that we should let the audience know about before we let them ask you questions? I mean, in terms of shows or?
Things are quiet. I mean, I have a couple group shows coming up, but this summer is dedicated to an extension of my displacement project, where I am traveling the US and photographing individuals who are housed in the camps that I've documented. And so that was really meant to happen last year. And of course it could not. So it's happening this summer. So I'm going through the US from East Coast to West Coast and finding these individuals. I go to their home, I take their portrait, and I record their oral history of flight. So that's what this summer is bringing.
Very curious how you're going to put that together.
Yes. There's multiple formats, but a book is going to be one of them for sure.
Oh, cool. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we can open up the questions for the audience. Max, do you want to take that on? And again, thank you so much to FotoFest for having us have this talk. It's been really great.
Yeah.
To be here again.
Yeah, thank you both for that really enlightening conversation. It's so thrilling to hear more about your work, Krista, and it's such a pleasure to be talking about these things a week before the exhibition closes, so we can really remind ourselves what this exhibition is about, home and the people who live there. And it's it's about people and place, community, friendships, history. And I loved that you two were both really talking through those ideas in such depth. If anybody from the audience has a question, feel free to enter that into the chat if you're watching on Zoom, or under the comment section on YouTube, and we'll field that from you. I don't know if we have one right now, but I have a bit of a follow-up question based on some of your conversation about architecture. One of the things that we had been talking about was a little bit about was the sort of psychology of space. And I thought it was really interesting to see the sort of the painting work that you had done, this kind of like stripping down to create some a sort of a transformative moment in its most simple terms. Can you talk about how you think about translating these spaces that hold such deep psychological and emotional affects, I would say, and into something that is its most simplest form. It's into something that's aesthetically recognizable. Can you talk about what that process looks like a bit?
Yeah, that was there's a number of transitions with that, right? So all the painting work begins photographically first. So it's a matter of, and even photographically, I'm not, shooting the city landscape. I'm shooting details. I'm shooting aspects of where buildings overlap or repeated windows in a space, or shooting outside of my window across to see the windows in the city. When I was living in the city, that was a big, that's like a very clear memory of mine of kind of being in my bedroom at dark and kind of seeing the lit windows of the buildings across the way. And so kind of photographing that environment that was surrounding me. And then I would take those, print them out, and then kind of go in, drawing on top of them, kind of sketching on top of them, and then forming these compositions from that. And the installations, when I started doing the wall drawings, which grew. You saw one of the very first one I showed with the black pieces. That was the very first time I had done wall drawings and extending to the surface of the exhibition environment. And then that just grew to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And so they became these immersive installations that really then talked about like psychology of space. You'd walk into this space, you'd have a reaction, you'd have, it would be visceral, you would enter into a room that had this encompassing you. So there's very much a relationship to that as the installations progressed.
Yeah, and I feel in this installation that we have at in Houston for public life, one of the ways that you bring in the viewer is through this, even if you haven't seen this pattern of textile, there is something familiar to it. You kind of can recognize the shapes, the patterns from something. It conjures up a memory that draws you in, that makes you feel connected to the work in a way. I think it's quite interesting, and the placement in Houston really accentuates that.
I also see in your work, there's a lot of lines, like in your installation work, there's lines that draw you through a building or to another image, or or you have the source material. There's always some directional movement going on as well, which I think is really interesting because you employ the space as well as just putting, you don't just put an image up on the wall, you really employ the space, whether it's through this use of layers and sort of shadow echoing, or these lines that draw you around, or the depth of the work, you know?
And I wanted to ask a question. You know, Peggy Sue asked you about your relationship and your interest in architecture, and you said you get that question from time to time. But I was wondering about the same question, but in relationship to texture and tactility, which seems to be such an important part of your work and is not for every artist that works with photographic media. I wonder if you could talk about that, your interest in it, any history that might give us clues as to how that developed. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, do you mean as far as how I'm photographing the buildings, or just how I'm dealing with the photographs?
I'm talking about the objects that you make.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that complicated sort of relationship with photography began with this interdisciplinary kind of background. I've always been interested in media, right? And that could be painted media, that could be photographic media, you know, that could be sculptural media, you know, and the relationship to object. And so I've never been really satisfied with just a printed image. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I guess it's because I've always wanted to have the hand somehow within the piece, even if this like is a digital hand, right? I still create the files, the laser cutter still cuts them, and but there is some aspect of hand in there, even if it's more machined. And so there's always been this interest, and Peggy talked about it too a little bit, how photographers like want that tactility. You know, they kind of want to be able to deal with media, and a lot of people do that in the darkroom. And I just happen to be doing that, you know, in a more digital space. But it really stems from that desire of wanting the mark of the human and the hand and the interaction of the object, and the presence of an image to kind of come forward to the audience.
I think some of that comes from your upbringing. I mean, you said you were working in a lot of different, and I know I did the same thing. So there's all these different feelings that you had. You were painting and you know, the things that you were doing growing up. So I'm sure that feeds into it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And even though the works that are up in Houston now are flat in terms of dimension, you know, actual dimensionality, there that texture still comes through with the weaving pattern, and so you see that. And I'd love to see how they play out in your sort of ideal format too. Can't wait to see them.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited as far as the public life exhibition goes, you know, the scale of them, because it's always a desire to like, and many individuals have been like, oh, you got to make this really big, and there are limitations for that when using a laser cutter, right? So there are size limitations with the size of a laser bed and things like that, but that was one really exciting thing for me, was to kind of see them big in space as far as the public life.
And Max positioned them in this place that while it doesn't have the same political dialogues as the content of the work, it's still a transitional neighborhood that is, you know, going from a more commercial to a more residential use. And in fact, it's really, if you have the chance to drive by, it's really writ large, because on one end is a shopping center and warehouses, and on the very other end is a brand new apartment building, and your work is sandwiched right between them. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and despite the sort of cultural and historical specificity of the work, the story is relatable. And this is on a street where so much of Houston is going by. I mean, it's one of the busiest streets. It is the busiest streets in our area, in our neighborhood. So it's pretty amazing to think about all of the people who are looking at this work and thinking about tradition and thinking about the future and thinking about their own family history, and thinking about what home means through the lens of your work. And today's talk was really wonderful because it was, you could hear so much shared experience and shared perspectives and similar stories through the lens of different cultural histories and narratives through your specific tale, your life.
And we should also, Max, I should also add that it's also adjacent to a very, for Houston, a very old neighborhood, the old 6th Ward, where there's still a lot of traditional and vernacular architecture. So that also plays into the reading and sort of the tension, the tension there between the older residents trying to hold on to their properties and this newer development that is happening all the time in Houston.
Sounds like an amazing conversation between all the works and what's happening in the site as well.
Quick question from the audience: which cameras did you use, Krista? Was it a digital or film camera? That's a photographer's question right there.
It is. Yeah, it's the photo question. So I use digital. So I use digital camera. But with some of actually with both of the series Displacement and What Remains, I'm also using a drone. So I use a drone to document some of the spaces as well.
Can I ask you a question that I think would be interesting for the audience as well? Given that you're doing so much three-dimensional work, what are your editions like when you create, these laser cut images and these three-dimensional images? What are your editions like?
You mean like in the reproducibility of them, or in the amount, or
gallery, and you put them up for people to collect? What kind of, just out of curiosity, because I think that would be interesting for the audience, because you are working in 3 dimensions, and I'm sure each piece takes quite a while to create if you make more than one edition.
Mm-hmm. I do make more than one. With the collage series, those are unique, but with What Remains and with the Displacement series, there are additions. Some of the Displacement pieces that are double layers that are more sculptural, those are unique. But the single layer pieces, there are additions of those. And depending, for the Displacement series, where I showed one of the images that was partially cut with text, that is a negotiation that I have with the laser cutter. So those editions change because the way that the laser cutter works, which I'm not totally sure about, but it cuts in random, but not completely random. So I have to kind of create these strange files to help make the laser cutter do what I want it to do, to kind of cut in certain areas. And I have to kind of stop it at certain points. So there's a real kind of conversation and negotiation I'm having with technology with that. And to make editions of that, they are very difficult to reproduce exactly. So because of the way I'm kind of handling technology with that.
But that goes back to the materiality again, and it really shows the physicality of it. I think that's really great that you, I mean, it's terrible that you have that like difficulty, but it shows that photographic medium is not always so easily mechanically reproduced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And it's a new way of showing the artist hand.
It is, yeah.
Through technology that I think is pretty fascinating. Wow. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Peggy Sue. Max, thank you for putting together such a great show and program. And thank you, Brandon, for the technical backup, and for the audience for joining us. Yeah, that was a great talk, and you've given me a lot to think about. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, I hope that you will join us again. You'll sign up for the FotoFest emails on our website, and follow Krista and follow Peggy Sue. And yeah, more to come. And we really appreciate you being here. So have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.